If you spend X amount of time, which is going to be years and years and years, it's going to be a dedication factor to try to earn a black belt in jujitsu. But you actually have a larger dream, which is to then carry those jujitsu skills to mixed martial arts and be able to thrive there later in life. Are you wasting your time? And I'm very frustrated with the question because I understand that logically, when you're not wearing a gi in mixed martial arts, why are you practicing in one since you were 5 and 6 and 7 years old as a little boy to earn your jiu-jitsu black belt? But I don't see how it translates. Look, if you're grabbing you have to understand, there's something to be said for confidence. If a guy is a purple belt in jiu-jitsu and he goes into an MMA fight with a black belt in jiu-jitsu, there's just going to be an intimidation factor, particularly early in his career. He's not going to factor everything else and say, well, yeah, but that's one discipline, and I've done a lot of boxing, and I wrestled a little bit over here in junior high, and I think I can put all the pieces together. You're just not going to do that. This belt system is a very real thing, at least psychologically. The reality is a pretty good purple belt and a black belt are kind of going to wash each other out in a mixed martial arts competition. But there's something to be said to have that confidence. I also have to tell you, in the jiu-jitsu system at the grassroots level, to be able to train with brown and black belts, you have to either be a brown or a black belt. So now, just in the practice room, you're being experienced to a higher level of guy, not only athletically, but through his psychological commitment and time that he's put into the sport, which is what earned him those belts. So to act as though going through a belt system is going to develop anything bad, I just don't agree with that. Look, let me tie this into strength and conditioning. Strength and conditioning is such a real part of mixed martial arts. Now, how much of it, I don't know. No more than 10%, and likely as little as 5%. But when you talk to a great strength and conditioning coach, a very famous one like Mike Dolce is more than happy to admit diet and strength and exercise, these are just an inch. But we're playing a game of inches. We're playing a game where everybody is absolutely equal and somebody is going to move ahead just by a hair, which is why you have to focus on everything. I will do for strength and conditioning quite often a tire exercise. Go up with Coach Dave, we grab a big old tire and we just flip it back and forth. Then we go to a different size tire and we flip that, and then we go to a third time, we flip that back and forth, and an hour later we're exhausted, we all go home. There's no tires in the octagon. If I was to put my shoes on and go for a run, and running is a great way to fill up your gas tank, there's no shoes in the octagon, there's no track, there's no hills, there's no running taking place, but I would disagree if you tried to then draw a connection that flipping those tires or running those hills somehow doesn't give you a strength or a condition or an advantage that carries over to the cage. One thing doesn't have to equal the other. I get how logically you want to spend more of your time on the things that look like what you're doing in competition on Saturday night. But the reality that we all know from life, one isn't always the other. Sometimes you can get beneficial areas. I mean, sometimes just sleeping more at night can be a competitive advantage. So what, some jerk's going to come and tell me, well, there's no bed and there's no pillow and there's no blankets in the octagon, so what does sleep matter? What are you talking about? Sleep matters. I don't care if you're taking a nap in the cage. Sleep matters. One thing, while being obvious, may not look like the other, but they all help. Let me just give you an example for the history of jiu-jitsu. You used to only be able to compete in a gi. Abu Dhabi came around in 99, 2000, I think in 99. But one thing about Abu Dhabi is they went to no gi, and this was like this big shocking thing. And as a matter of fact, I think you were even allowed to wear a gi if you wanted to. It was optional. You could not use it and grab it, kind of like the early days of mixed martial arts. If your opponent wore one, you couldn't use it and grab it, but you were allowed to wear one, and Hoist Gracie elected to, just by example. So if you wanted to compete, if you had a dream of being a grappler, it'd be like saying I have a dream of being a wrestler, but I refuse to use a singlet. You got to wear a singlet. The singlet comes with it. So if you wanted to do grappling, you had to do a gi. I remember the time, and I can't remember the year, but I do remember the time when tournaments started to open up with no gi. Nobody entered them. It was kind of like when I was a kid, they would have a freestyle tournament. Oh, and by the way, if you wanted to stick around, we'd do Greco. And you'd have this many guys for freestyle, and then the Greco would all be over within 2 hours. And it was just one of those things that nobody did. So when no-gi started to become popular, and then it really started to gain traction. I mean, EBI gets a lot of credit for that. He only contested with no-gi, but now guys can compete. They started to be able to do belt systems for no-gi specifically. IBJJF, started to recognize under their official rules, which is what grapplers respect more than anything, is the IBJJF for whatever reason. They started to contest world championships for no gi, silver medals, bronze medals. I mean, it was this really honorable thing. Then guys started coming out with DVDs. I mean, the industry started, but I remember when no gi came out, like, you had to actually define it. You had to actually say no gi. I mean, it was like the weirdest. You couldn't just go a jiu-jitsu tournament. If you wanted to just say jiu-jitsu, you never said gi, you just said a jiu-jitsu tournament. No gi came in. This was like a term. This was like Greco-Roman. Like, you had to set this aside. So you couldn't dream of being a grappler and not just accept the fact I have to put a gi on. Like, it's a little bit of a new phenomenon. So when you have some of these older guys, the Diaz boys who came from Cesar Gracie, just by example, because they train in a gi all the time, a George St. Pierre who dates his career back to the very early 2000s, you had to train in a gi back then. There's a little bit of a history to it that also comes with the respect that you then lie to yourself and say, well, that's a great way of training because it cuts down the slipperiness and it holds position. I don't agree with that. I have a black belt in jiu-jitsu. I do not agree with you that it makes you work on position more. I believe position is much easier to maintain when there's no slipperiness. Oh, and by the way, if you do start to get a little fatigued, just grab the guy's lapels. He's not going to go anywhere. So I don't know that I agree with that, but I also don't think that this is a debate that we truly have to get to the bottom of. If you're in a gym and you're working out and you're getting your heart rate up and you're pushing and pulling with a partner on a daily basis, you're getting better at fighting. The end. And I don't agree. If a guy wants to pop in a college restroom and go get a 30-minute drill in, with some young just get his footwork down, get his heart rate up, get all sweaty and go home, I think that he got better that day. And when you sit around and you debate the absolute best ways to train, you can have all the philosophies you want, but ultimately, what we do in sport is we turn to the absolute best guys, and then we defer to however it is they train. The Diaz boys train in a gi. George St. Pierre trains in a gi. Khabib Nurmagomedov every now and then goes and throws the jacket on. I don't think he calls it a gi because it's Samba. But ultimately, you start to defer to some of these guys. Look, I was just on YouTube last night, and it was a video that was updated 6 days ago. Therefore, I believe it to be current. But I don't know. Possibly the video just got put out there currently. John Jones shows up to a Naga event that I believe was just happening in a geographic location that he was. Maybe it was Albuquerque, maybe it was back home in Albany. I think there was just a tournament, and John was in town. He shows up and enters the tournament. He has 2 matches. One was with, looked like a guy that was more of an enthusiast, but he went out there and did his level best to compete with John Jones. I'm sure you can imagine how that went. But John's next match with what appeared to be about a 10-year-old girl, maybe an 11-year-old girl, but these were the matches. John entered the tournament. He followed the rules. This is how the bracket played, and he went out and did the 2 matches. So I understand the debate over gi versus no gi. I just don't know why we're having it. It appears that if you're grabbing an opponent and you're pushing and pulling and you're getting your heart rate up, if you're going out and shaking hands with an opponent, I don't care if it's an 11-year-old girl. And I get that that isn't the strongest debate to my argument, but that's the champion of the world, and this is what he went and did. So if we're going to apply the same rules to this sport that we do to every other sport, which is ultimately we debate the topics, but then we defer to whatever the great ones do. Whatever Tom Brady does is what we're going to influence our 4th and 5th and 6th grade sons to go out and do with the hopes that will get us to that point. I think that the ultimate lesson here isn't a debate between gi versus no gi. I strongly don't understand where that comes from. And while one is better for mixed martial arts, I get it. But if you go in and do no gi training, it's a little bit more impactful. You're probably going to get about 20 minutes in. If you go in with a gi, it's a little bit less impactful, a little bit more strategic, and you're going to be able to train for about an hour. So you have a bit of a push and pull and a bit of a wash here. It seems to me this is a silly debate, and there's room for both.